Good afternoon. My name is April Leytem. I work with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Kimberly, Idaho. And today I'm going to be talking about two of our long-term studies that are looking at nutrient cycling related to using manure in both forage systems and commercial cropping systems. So we're going to look at two different long-term studies. The first is what we call the long-term manure study, where we're evaluating manure application rate and timing on nutrient cycling and crop quality. Our second study is what we call the cover crop study, which is where we're evaluating the effects of manure versus fertilizer, different types of tillage and cover crop on nutrient cycling and crop quality. In addition to nutrient management, we also looked at a wide variety of things on these long-term studies, including soil health, water balances, antibiotic resistance, greenhouse gas emissions, and carbon storage and sequestration. So if you'd like information on any of these other topics, please feel free to contact us and we'll get you the information you're interested in. So the long-term manure study was a study that we started in the fall of 2012, and the official end of the study was this year, right now, 2020. So we have two identical fields, as you can see in the picture on the side here. And the difference between the fields is we staggered the crop rotation. So the north field was wheat, potato, barley, sugar beet, and then in the south field, we started with barley instead. So we have a control where we had no application of manure or fertilizer. We have our fertilizer plots where we applied just commercial fertilizer based on the U of I recommendations for the different crops each year, and 3 rates of manure that we applied either annually or every other year. And this field is located in southern Idaho, so it's a Portneuf silt loam. We have a pretty high pH, close to 8. And everything is fully irrigated because we do not get much precipitation during the growing season. So our treatments, our manure treatments were 18, 36, and 52 wet tons of manure per acre. You can kind of see here a little bit what those treatments look like. Just to give you an idea of what the high manure treatment looks like, this is what it looks like in different situations. People see 52 tons of wet manure and they think that we're piling the manure on, but actually you can really still see the soil even at that application rate. So these rates were basically picked based on the highest rate being what producers might typically apply in our region, all the way down to a very low rate, which would also require the use of supplemental inorganic fertilizer to meet crop nitrogen and sometimes phosphorus needs. So our goal was to apply the same amount of dry manure each year. It's kind of difficult to balance all your nutrients if we try to do it on an NRP basis. So we decided to do just based on dry weight. And each year we did a pretty good job at the 3 different application rates of balancing for dry weight. But what you'll notice is that due to differences in manure nitrogen and phosphorus content, even though you're applying manure at the same rate every year, you could be applying quite a bit different amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so it's really important when you use manure in a cropping rotation to analyze your manure each year to make sure you know how much nitrogen and phosphorus is being put on. So we looked at first crop yields and quality. So we wanted to know, would crops respond to manure nutrients similarly to what they do when we put on inorganic fertilizer? And were there any negative effects on either crop quality or disease due to using manures? And this is a concern for some of the commodity crops, particularly potato and sugar beet, where you could have soil-borne diseases and pathogens. And then there's also quality concerns related to wheat. So first we'll take a look at barley yields. And just to orient everyone to these sets of slides that you're about to see, what I've done is I've taken and tried to color code them by rate. So the lowest manure rate are in blue, the medium rate is in green, the higher rate is in yellow. And then we move to fertilizer, which is that purple, and the control at the very end. And all the slides will be set up this way, with the annual application being the first bar and the biennial being the second bar within each color. So our barley yield was not affected by manure additions from 2013 to 2017. However, in 2019, the yields at the lowest manure application rate were greater than the yields with the high manure application rate. Although in all of the years, there was no significant difference between whether we used fertilizer or did not use fertilizer. And you can see that at the highest manure application rates, there's a slight depression in yield. And we believe that that's due to lodging, which was a problem in almost every year in the barley at the higher manure application rates. And so we think we're just losing some of that grain in the field during harvest. Of concern related to quality is barley protein. So this is important because as protein is increasing, your malt quality is decreasing. And the barley that we grew was specifically a malting variety. So typically, if you're below 14 or 13.5%, your grain can be taken for malt. However, if your proteins get too high, then your grain will be rejected, usually by the processor, and it'll have to be sold as feed barley, and that's a pretty big loss in dollar value. So we did see that the barley protein content increased with increasing manure application rate in most years. Taking a year off of manure application, so when we applied manure every other year, that did seem to reduce protein content in those treatments. And it was interesting that the barley protein has actually been decreasing every year since 2015. And I don't know if that's just because we're doing a better job managing nitrogen on those sites after we got rid of the background effects, or if that has something to do with climate or some other variable. But I would have initially been concerned about using manure with barley at high manure rates because we were getting to protein levels that would have been unacceptable for malt. However, in the last 2 years, even at our high manure application rates, we were still well below the cutoff threshold for protein. If we look at wheat yields, similar to barley, we did not see a significant effect of manure application rate versus fertilizer. We did see a couple differences just in 2013 between the manure application rates themselves. As with barley, in some years we did have lodging, although in wheat we did not have lodging every year. So in 2019, for example, there was no lodging, and you can see that the yields across the board were very similar, obviously except for the control, which hadn't had fertilizer or any other nutrient source in quite a while. So lodging was our biggest problem with the grain. So you can see on the left the control always standing up quite well, but our high manure application rates, lots of times the entire plot would just be laid down. And we were actually using a growth regulator. So even when we used the growth regulator, we were not necessarily avoiding this lodging problem. And we believe that's part of why we have the lower yields in the higher manure application rate plots. So one of the things we did notice when using manure is that you tend to have a lot more tillers per plant than when you are just using inorganic fertilizer. And they also tend to have more heads, and we think that the excessive tillering with all those heads on them does create the lodging problem, probably due to a reduction in stem strength. So looking at sugar beet yields, the yields were very similar in every year between fertilizer and the manure application rates. In 2018, the yields for the highest rate of manure were actually greater than for the low manure rates, but they still were not different from the fertilizer. What we did notice, though, is that you definitely have quite a bit more biomass in the tops when we added manure compared to fertilizer. And in lots of cases, the roots were quite a bit bigger in the plots that are receiving manure. And although these differences in yield are not significantly different, numerically they were higher in the manure plots than the fertilizer plots, which will become important in just a minute here. When we looked at the sugar beet sugar percentage, we definitely see a decrease in sugar content with higher manure application rates. And this was significant most of the time. And compared to the fertilizer, you did get depressed sugar content at high manure application rates. However, because you had a slightly higher yield when you had manure application, even though the sugar content was a little bit lower, our estimated recoverable sugar was not different between fertilizer and manure in any year. In some years, there was a slight reduction in the higher manure application rates compared to the lower, but they were never significantly different than the fertilizer. The one other concern is that as you did have higher manure application rates, your brain nitrate in the beets was increasing, and that's a contaminant that has to be removed during the processing of the beets. And therefore, when you price out how much a producer would have gotten per acre based on the recoverable sugar, they could have a slight decrease in price because of an excess of brain nitrate. It all depends on how the sugar companies are doing the calculations in any given year and how big that penalty is. With potatoes, we saw very little effect of manure application on either yield, disease, or quality. The one thing that we did see is that you have, for the higher manure application rates, you did see a little bit lower specific gravity, which could be a concern. But these were not so dramatic that they were a huge concern for us during the project. So looking at what's happening in the soil, because the soil is really going to help moderate and control a lot of the nutrient cycling that we have in the cropping systems, we wanted to take a look and see how soil nutrients were changed by addition of nutrients. And so this is soil sampling that was done this spring, so pre-plant spring sampling in 2020. And so this would have been following 8 manure applications. As you can see, the organic matter increased quite a bit, so our controls were about 1.2%, while our highest manure application rates were at 3%, so more than doubled the amount of carbon in that system. Interesting that the pH actually decreased at high manure application rates, so the manure is kind of acting as an acidifying agent as it's breaking down in the soil. You can see both Olsen phosphorus and potassium increase dramatically with manure application. So going from 14 parts per million Olsen P fertilizer up to 190 parts per million in the highest manure application rate. And for potassium, going from 150 parts per million in the fertilizer plots to a little over 1,200 at the highest manure application rate. So you're really accumulating quite a bit of nutrients in these soils when you're applying manure. And I did include a few other micronutrients, and as you can see, not only are you getting NP and K when you're applying manure to these plots, but you're also getting a whole bunch of micronutrients in addition to that. One other thing of concern is that the EC and the SAR did increase a little bit, so that's the sodium absorption ratio. And this could be an issue if you have really high manure application rates and you have salt-sensitive crops. So every year we would take these post-harvest cores from each of the plots down to between 4 and 6 feet and look at the nutrients throughout the soil profile. So this is looking at the Olsen P following either 1 manure application on the top or 4 to 7 manure applications on the bottom. And as you can clearly see, continual application of manure at high rates really drove up the soil phosphorus in the first 2 feet. And even though these are really silty soils, high calcareous content, where you wouldn't expect to see a lot of phosphorus movement, even at the high application rates, we're starting to see differences down to 3 feet. So phosphorus is moving through these soil profiles. And that can be a concern around here, as we do have areas where we have pretty shallow soils where you may only have maybe 2 or 3 feet of soil. And if you're continually applying manure at high rates, you could start losing some of the phosphorus to leaching, which could eventually end up in surface waters. But of course, the biggest concern is loss via erosion and surface runoff. And so these high soil test P levels right at the surface could be a big concern for transporting both total P in particulate form as well as soluble P off of these fields. So the agronomic rate is usually around 20 parts per million Olson, and after our 4 to 7 manure application rates, all of the manure treatments were above what we would consider to be the agronomic threshold. The regulatory threshold has been set at 40 parts per million, and once you get above that, there is some control as to how much manure you are allowed to apply to any given field. And after 4 to 7 manure applications, only one treatment, which was the lowest rate applied every other year. So only 4 applications. That was the only treatment that was still below the threshold. So it's pretty easy to build up your soil test P even when you're using what we would consider fairly low rates of application. So it's really important to keep track of how much manure is going on, how much phosphorus is going on, and how much is coming off the field with your crop. The inorganic nitrogen was a little more all over the board, especially in 2013, which is probably due to the residual effect of the past management on these fields. And by 2018, you could see that we did a really good job in the control plots of mining nitrogen out of the soil profile all the way down to 6 feet. All the manure treatments, especially the annual high manure treatments, were quite a bit higher at the topsoil. And even throughout this soil profile, most of the manure treatments were greater than the fertilizer treatments. So we're definitely putting some extra nitrogen into the soil profile, and it is slowly moving down over time. So we wanted to look at how treatments are affecting mineralization throughout the growing season. So we had 2 separate studies, one where we took soils in the beginning of the season and we incubated them in the lab. And then we had a field study where we collected soils from 1 foot and 2 foot depths, and they were put into these buried bags that you can see here in the picture and buried in the field, and then they were pulled out slowly over time. And so that was to be able to mimic the type of temperature conditions that you would have in the field as those bags are impermeable to water. So water is not moving in and out of them, but they are subjected to the same temperature regime that you would have in the field. So if we look at nitrogen mineralization throughout the growing season, you can see that nitrogen mineralization rates are greater for the manure application than the fertilizer, particularly the higher rates of manure application. And that mineralization continues well into the fall. Even when we start to have cooler temperatures, it still looks like it's increasing at the same rate as it was earlier in the season. And this was data from last year, from 2019. And so in 2019, we had grain, and so our grain would have been harvested in August. And so it's important to remember that once you harvest the grain, that even though the crop is not there, you're still having this mineralization happening from the manure in your soil. And so it's pretty important to manage your post-harvest irrigation to make sure that you're not putting on a lot of water after you've harvested to fill up your soil profile for next year, because you could end up moving a lot of your nitrogen out of the profile into groundwater where we don't want it. So this is a look at the net nitrogen mineralization over the growing season. And this would have been the amount of total inorganic nitrogen at the end of the season minus what we started with at the beginning of the season for each treatment. And so you can see here that net mineralization varies quite a bit from year to year. And this is probably driven by climatic variables that would affect microbial activity, as well as it could be related to manure characteristics. Our net mineralization ranged from approximately 25 to 325 pounds per acre per year, with the higher manure application rates typically having greater net N mineralized than your lower application rates, and definitely greater than your fertilizer and control plots. What's really interesting is that our control plots, even though they're not receiving any type of fertilizer at all, they're still producing between 50 and 150 pounds of N per year. So that's quite a bit of nitrogen that's being produced just naturally in our soils. So we compared what we found in the field versus what we would measure in the incubation study. as we're considering the incubation study to be the maximum amount of nitrogen that you would expect to be released. And you can see from year to year, the ability of the soil in the field to produce the same amount of nitrogen as that in the incubation studies can vary. In 3 years, we had pretty much the same amount of nitrogen mineralized in the field as we did in the incubation studies, so it pretty much met its maximum potential. But in the 3 other years, it was quite a bit lower. In 2016, it was even as low as 56%, so about half of what we saw in the field. So this gives us a good indication that there's a really big influence on climatic variables in the field that influence nitrogen mineralization. And this also makes it really hard for us to predict in any given year how much nitrogen might be released from these manures. So we looked at the cumulative net nitrogen mineralization over this 2013 to 2019, following 7 years or 4 years of manure application. And we found that the net mineralization ranged from 590 to a little over 1,500 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So that's quite a bit of nitrogen being produced. And our biennial rates ranged between 14 and 40% less nitrogen mineralized than the annual rates. And it was interesting that at the low rates, there was a greater discrepancy between the annual and biennial in terms of how much nitrogen was mineralized over the season, but as you're increasing these manure application rates, the difference dropped quite a bit, down to 14%, which makes me think that we're reaching some sort of maximum mineralization potential at these higher manure application rates. But on average, the annual N mineralized ranged from 84 to 217 pounds of N per acre. And over the same time period, the control plots were releasing on average about 90 pounds of N per acre. So about 30% of the cumulative manure N that was added was mineralized at the highest manure application rates. At the lower manure application rates, it's a little bit closer to 20, but it looks like about 30% is the maximum amount that we're finding over this 7-year time period. So we tried to look at ways to estimate the nitrogen mineralization based on easy to measure soil parameters from samples that were taken prior to planting in the spring. The best relationship looked like it was between the pre-plant total inorganic nitrogen, which is the combination of both ammonium and nitrate, and how much net mineralization there was in the field. And there was about 3.5 times the pre-plant inorganic nitrogen ended up being the amount that was mineralized over the season. Although you can see that this varied from year to year, likely due to climatic events. The other indicator that was somewhat useful seemed to be the pre-plant total nitrogen, and that was not as well correlated as the pre-plant inorganic nitrogen, but was still fairly well correlated. So now we're going to look at the plant nutrient uptake and overall balances in this study. So I'm going to focus on the sugar beet and potato because they were pretty interesting. As we saw earlier, the barley protein increased with manure application rate, and we saw the same trend in the wheat, so there was greater N uptake in both of those crops as well with increasing manure application rate. In the sugar beets, we looked at both the amount of nitrogen accumulated in the tops and in the roots, and what you can see is that the tops accumulate quite a bit more nitrogen than the roots do. And within the sugar beet, there was a significant effect of nitrogen uptake with increasing manure application rate. So when we look at the difference between the nitrogen uptake in the fertilizer versus the highest manure application rate, the highest manure application rate took up 1.3 times the amount of nitrogen than the fertilizer treatment did. And when you look at the amount of nitrogen in the tops, it ranged from about 114 to 266 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's important because that residue is going to be chopped off in the field and left and can become a nitrogen source for a crop the following year. The potato vines also accumulated more nitrogen than the tubers did, but they were not as sensitive to manure application rate as the sugar beets were. There looked like there was a slight increase with the highest manure application rate, but not nearly as dramatic as what you see in the sugar beets. And in the vines, again, there was an accumulation of about 137 to 209 pounds of N per acre. And this nitrogen is also returned to the soil at the end of the growing season. So it's really important to account for these additions of nitrogen back into the soil with crop residue that could be used by the plants the following year. If we look at plant uptake over the whole rotation over the 7 years, you can see that the cumulative nitrogen uptake increased with increasing manure application rate. There was a little less accumulated with the biennial versus the annual application rates, but it was only significant at the lowest manure application rate. However, if you look at the difference between N uptake in the fertilizer treatments versus the manure treatments, the fertilizer treatments took up 29% less total nitrogen than the highest manure application rate treatments. So having that manure in the system, especially over longer periods of time, really does amount to a pretty large amount of extra nitrogen that's mined out of the soil versus when you were just using inorganic fertilizer. And so it makes me question, do we need to have different nitrogen removal rates for fields that are receiving manure versus fertilizer? Since this is something that has to be included in our producers' nutrient management plans, maybe we need to account for the difference in fields where you may have manure and have more plant uptake than you would in fields where you just have fertilizer. If we look at the overall nitrogen balance over the 7 years, you can see on the left bar is the nitrogen that was put into the system, and on the right, what's coming out of the system for 3 of the manure application rates, the fertilizer and the control. The nitrogen that's applied with manure is much greater than that removed by the crops. The fertilizer, on the other hand, there was just slightly more nitrogen going in than came out with the harvested crops. However, in the 3 manure application examples we have here, that nitrogen is still sitting in the soil profile if you look at the whole profile down to 6 feet. One of the other losses that you can have in addition to leaching is nitrous oxide losses, and what we've demonstrated on these plots is that we're really only losing about 1% of total nitrogen as N2O to the atmosphere. So it's a pretty small loss to the system. So a lot of this nitrogen is going to remain in the soil. If we take that 30% nitrogen mineralization rate that we saw in the field, then if you look at what would be the available N versus what was taken out, we were removing about 59 to 112% of that available N that mineralized over that growing period. We'll take a look at phosphorus uptake. Again, this time I'm using sugar beet and potato as an example because they were really interesting to look at from a cropping perspective. In both the sugar beets and potato, the phosphorus uptake was greater in the roots and tubers versus that taken up in the tops. And in both crops this time, there was increasing phosphorus uptake with increasing manure application rate, although this was a little bit greater in the sugar beets than in the potatoes. So phosphorus uptake between the fertilizer treatment and the highest manure treatment in the sugar beet was 71%. And in the potatoes, there was a 40% increase between the fertilizer and the highest manure application treatment. We look at plant P uptake over the 7 years. Similar to nitrogen, the cumulative P uptake increased with increasing manure application rates. However, there was no difference between the annual versus the biennial treatments. And if we look at how much was removed with the fertilizer treatment compared to the highest manure treatment, the fertilizer was 24% less phosphorus removal than the highest manure application treatment. So again, makes me question whether we need to have different P removal rates for fields that are receiving manure versus fertilizer in order to more accurately account for how much phosphorus is being removed. Now we'll look at the overall phosphorus balance over the 7 years, and you can clearly see in the figure that the phosphorus applied with manure was much greater than that removed over the 7-year cropping rotation. The fertilizer P was much more balanced with slightly more in than what was taken out. But even with 7 years of a crop rotation, we've barely removed more phosphorus than what was applied with the first application on those high manure application rates. So that means that this phosphorus is accumulating in the soil, and if you remember back to the soils data, the soil test P has accumulated to approximately 10 times greater than the agronomic rate for these high manure application soils. So P accumulation in these soils becomes a long-term problem, which can have lasting impacts on the environment. It takes a really long time to draw this phosphorus out, and so therefore that phosphorus is available for loss if there is erosion or runoff from these fields. So now we'll switch to the cover crop study. This study is a little bit younger. It just started in the fall of 2015. And this is a continuous corn rotation. And we're looking at 3 different main effects: the effect of having fertilizer versus manure, and the effect of having a cover crop, which in this case is triticale, versus having no cover crop, and looking at a tillage effect of either conventional tillage versus minimum till. And these plots are actually located just to the south of our long-term study plots. So again, they're on a Portneuf silt loam with a pretty high pH, and everything is fully irrigated. And this image was taken from this spring, where you can really see the dramatic effects of the cover crop on the field out there. And those really dark squares are the cover crop where we had manure. The middle dark squares are where we had the cover crop but under fertilizer. So again, we tried to match the amount of dry manure that was added. And even when we try and do that, we still end up with very different amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus added. So I will again say this is really why it's important to measure the nutrients in your manure each year so you actually know how much is going on the field. We look at crop yields. Our main questions were, will the crops respond to manure nutrients similarly to those from fertilizer? And will the inclusion of a cover crop depress the yield of our silage corn? First, we'll take a look at the silage corn yield, which is listed here at a wet weight in tons per acre. And I tried to make these treatments a little bit easier to follow by color coding them. So the first 4 bars are all conventional till, they're in the blue. The second set of bars in the orange colors are the no-till plots. And so we have the first bar in each set being manure with cover crop, the second being manure without cover crop, then no manure with cover crop, and no manure with no cover crop. And the same with the no-till plots. So we can see here there was no effective treatment on silage corn yield in any year, although there was a slight yield depression starting in 2017, which is likely due to the inclusion of a cover crop. And that was because we harvested the triticale in the spring, and the corn gets planted slightly later if you wait for that triticale to mature. And so you lose some of the growing days during the season, which gives you a slight yield depression. The triticale yield, on the other hand, was greatly affected, especially by manure application. So you can see these bars here, the first 2, the bluer ones are conventionally tilled, the green ones are the no-till system, and the first bar in each of those series is where we have manure, and the second bar where we don't have manure. So you can see that the amount of triticale that was produced when you had manure was multiple times that of when we had no manure. There were a couple years, like in 2018, where we couldn't harvest because we got the triticale planted too late the year before, and the yields were too low to harvest. We had the same problem in 2019 with the fertilizer plots. And you can see in the picture below, this is a fertilizer plot next to a manure plot. So the triticale and those fertilizer plots are about up to my knees, but when you go into the manure plots, they're pretty much up to my waist. We look at the total tonnage, though, if we include both the silage and the triticale. There was no effective tillage on these yields, but the fields that had cover crop with manure had a much greater overall yield than treatments without manure and cover crop. And overall, our forage production was increased to about 40 tons per acre when we had the inclusion of the cover crop with manure, though. So even though our silage tonnage was decreased to mid-20s, overall, we still ended up with 40 tons per acre versus the 30 tons that we had gotten before we started implementing a cover crop into the rotation. So even though there can be a yield depression, you can still end up with more forage, especially when you have manure and it's producing that much biomass. We had some issues related to the no-till. We had to switch to minimum tillage, mostly due to compaction, and we were having problems with the planter, so we had to go to strip till. We definitely saw more weeds in the no-till plots, and that accumulation of manure on the surface could be a problem if you have salt issues, which could inhibit emergence, and it could also contribute to greater phosphorus runoff due to surface runoff from the fields, because that manure is just sitting on the soil surface since it's not incorporated. In terms of soil nutrients, we wanted to look and see if those were changing. Our post-harvest inorganic nitrogen, same as with the long-term manure study, we're looking at nutrients post-harvest down to about 4 to 6 feet, depending on the year. So we had increased inorganic nitrogen at the soil surface with manure additions compared to when we did not have manure applied. And we also saw increased inorganic nitrogen with depth for conventionally tilled plots with manure. But we did not see any true clear trends in the effect of cover crop versus no cover crop. Post-harvest Olsen P was a lot more straightforward. You can see after several manure applications that there's a clear increase in Olsen P at the soil surface. And it looks like our no-till plots appear to have a slightly higher P at the surface than our conventionally tilled plots, and that the inclusion of a cover crop actually appeared to decrease Olsen P at the surface compared to not having a cover crop. So we'll look at the plant nutrient uptake imbalances in this study. Plant nitrogen uptake over the 3 years, the cumulative uptake was greater when there was manure and cover crop, of course, because the cover crop pulls out an additional amount of nutrients. However, there was less of an effect on the cover crop when you just had fertilizer. It was that huge boost in biomass that we got with the addition of manure that was generating these larger uptakes of nutrients with the triticale. There was more nitrogen uptake with the manure fertilizer, with manure versus fertilizer, even when we didn't have a cover crop. So the effect of manure just on the corn was apparent like it was in the other long-term manure study. And tillage had no effect on nitrogen uptake. This reinforces the need to have different removal rates for fields that are receiving manure versus just fertilizer. If we look at the overall nitrogen balance over the 3 years, you can see again nitrogen in on the left, nitrogen out on the right for each of the treatments. So we have conventional tilled, which is the C, N is the no-till, M for manure, NM for no manure, and T for triticale, and F for fallow. So obviously, again, like we did with the long-term manure study, you can see that the amount of total nitrogen that's going onto these plots when we add manure is pretty significant and quite a bit greater than the nitrogen that's coming off. And in this case, even after the 3 rotations, The amount of total nitrogen that we put on with one application was pretty much greater in almost all cases than the amount that was pulled out over those 3 years. In the non-manure treatments, there was slightly more nitrogen out than in each year, but that does not account for natural nitrogen mineralization, so we were never deprived of nitrogen in this study. If we assume, again, a 30% nitrogen mineralization rate across years, then the nitrogen removed was about 93 to 130% of the mineralized N. So obviously we're picking up some of the control natural mineralization in some of these studies to help meet the crop needs. Plant P uptake was similar to what we saw with the long-term manure study. So there was greater uptake with manure addition and cover crop, but even when we did not have cover crop, there was still greater phosphorus uptake over the rotations when we had manure versus no manure. And again, tillage did not have any effect on uptake. So again, this reinforces the need to have different P removal rates for fields receiving manure versus. The overall P balance on these sites after the 3-year cropping rotation can be seen here, and you can see that the phosphorus applied with manure was much greater than that removed in those 3 years, whereas the fertilizer was pretty similar between what was going in and what was coming out. So this phosphorus has accumulated in the soil surface again, and the soil test P now is approximately 10 times greater than the agronomic rate when we had these manure applications. So even with one manure application, we added more phosphorus than what was removed with this 3-year cropping rotation. So you can see, again, it's really easy to build phosphorus up in these soils, and it's pretty hard to draw them back down once you've gotten to really high levels. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm here to answer any questions. And if you're listening to this at a later date, please feel free to email me at my email address here on the screen.